While people around the world gather to enter the new year, Chinese citizens are still baffled by COVID and economic meltdown. It appears that wearing masks or undergoing extensive testing is a thing of the past. However, for millions of Chinese citizens, they're used to seeing individuals in hazmat suits taking nasal and throat swab samples. Moreover, they used the green QR code that indicated they were COVID-free to utilise public transportation. The Chinese president gained an extraordinary third term in 2022 during the Communist Party of China's 20th National Congress. However, it was also the year in which he experienced the most public dissent since taking office in 2012. Protests erupted across China in November. Nearly 3 years into the pandemic, citizens took to the streets in several regions of the country to protest against Xi Jinping's controversial zero-COVID policies. The wave of civil disobedience constituted a historic challenge. Slogans such as "Down with the Chinese Communist Party," "Down with Xi Jinping," shook the entire country. Protests were held in response to a fire that killed 10 people on November 24th in a high-rise building in Urumqi, the capital of the Xinjiang region. The incident prompted great public outrage, with many online users claiming that occupants were unable to flee because the building had been partially closed down. Students at universities in locations including Nanjing and Beijing were seen silently protesting with blank sheets of paper. These unmarked white sheets of paper have become a powerful symbol of rebellion. Throughout the year, we've seen similar films go viral as a result of the famous zero-COVID policy, which has resulted in neighbourhood lockdowns and people being put into quarantine camps. Some residents who were placed under lockdown reported running short of basic necessities. Between battling a deadly virus on one hand and angry citizens due to the policies adopted to eradicate that virus on the other, the Chinese government has finally given up on COVID-19. It did not modify its policy, it simply failed. It had used the COVID-0 method for years to prevent disease spread. But two things happened. First, the Chinese people refused to take it any longer, as evidenced by the spectacular sequence of protests that began at the end of October and culminated in the November 24th fire. Zero COVID just destroyed the Chinese economy, so the dictatorship concluded it couldn't go on with COVID-0. As a result of the country temporarily relaxing its COVID-0 policy in December, China was baffled by a record spike in illnesses 3 years ago. The country has once again become the epicenter of COVID infections. Xizhou, a large industrial province near Shanghai, is fighting 1 million new COVID-19 infections every day. Remember that Beijing has not authorized any foreign COVID-19 vaccines for use by its populace, instead relying on Chinese vaccinations such as Sinovac and Sinopharm. According to scientists, these are just as effective as other globally licensed vaccines. The National Health Commission has ceased reporting asymptomatic illnesses, making it more difficult to trace instances in China's healthcare system. The world's second largest economy has also been stifled by the repeated COVID strategy. Frequent and severe lockdowns significantly reduced consumer spending, disrupted supply systems, and resulted in substantial job losses. Not long ago, violent protests erupted around Foxconn's flagship iPhone plant in Chengdu, central China, as workers clashed with security personnel over compensation and housing conditions. Such occurrences have prompted multinational corporations to consider alternatives to China. Because of how precarious the Chinese economy is currently, 2023's estimated GDP is expected to be about 10% lower than 2024's, which is also not all that high on the graph. Outside of China, reopening will have both positive and bad consequences. One factor to consider is tourism. Tourists will start to go out and about again, which will be very excellent news for countries that rely significantly on Chinese tourism. And for a region like Hong Kong, that will imply a significant boost to GDP. Economists estimate it will rise by nearly 8% if China completely reopens. Although Western countries are beginning to impose travel restrictions on Chinese tourists, this will have less impact on their economies because they are less reliant on Chinese tourist expenditure. However, another unintended consequence of China's reopening is the impact on the West. China is a major user of commodities, purchasing roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and 3/5 of the world's iron. As China's economy accelerates, it increases demand for commodities, driving up worldwide prices. For example, Goldman Sachs believes that a full Chinese reopening will cause prices to rise by around a quarter when compared to today's pricing. This suspected inflation and a possible crackdown by the government on firms, like we have seen in the past, is causing investors to move their investment out the country. Even worse, the new investors are also reluctant to invest there. According to several indicators, foreign investment in new factories in China has decreased. Apple, for example, has moved some of its production from China to Vietnam and India, owing in part to the instability of operating during the closing days of the zero coverage policy. So, once China is completely reopened, one of the great challenges will be how soon that trust is restored and whether China can entice international investors and business people to return. As the new coronavirus swept the world and quickly expanded into a global pandemic, China's initial actions, which included citywide lockdowns and mass testing campaigns, appeared to be effective. According to government figures, China was one of the least affected global economies and emerged as one of the first to restart normal output. The government propaganda apparatus readily embraced the triumphant narrative and lauded the superiority of the Chinese system. The pandemic was no longer a public health problem for Xi, who had built his personal reputation and even political legacy on the China way. Meanwhile, Chinese media sites have constantly emphasized the huge mortality tolls in Western countries, which are in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. The wolf warrior diplomats bemoaned the West's failure to duplicate China's homework. However, extremely potent mRNA vaccines created by American pharmaceutical corporations such as Pfizer and Moderna, as well as the highly transmissible Omicron subvariant, changed the game for Beijing and the rest of the world. For China, Omicron simply meant that it was no longer possible to pursue COVID-0 without choking its economy. In March of this year, only 3 months after the federal government set the GDP growth target of 5.5%, it became evident that this aim was unattainable. The most recent episode was the Foxconn fiasco in Zhengzhou. Massive protests erupted in iPhone City in November, costing Apple $1 billion per week in lost iPhone sales, pushing the tech giant to consider shifting production out of China. After the real estate market catastrophe that began in late 2021, the seemingly never-ending zero-COVID policy gave local governments another severe blow. Many communities are apparently straining to pay for mass daily testing expenses and quarantine enforcement. The Chinese government reached a breaking point in late November, just weeks after the historic coronation of Xi Jinping as China's supreme leader at the Communist Party's 20th Party Congress, when widespread protests erupted over the continuation of the harsh lockdowns. It was the largest spontaneous demonstration against the government since Tiananmen Square, and is sometimes referred to as the Blank Paper movement, since many protesters held the blank paper to avoid censorship. Xi Jinping purportedly recognised the public's dissatisfaction with visiting European leaders. Zero COVID was gone in a matter of days. 3 years of strict control should have given China enough time to strengthen its healthcare system, import effective mRNA vaccines and antiviral medicines, promote vaccinations among senior citizens and people with compromised immune systems, expand the number of ICUs in Chinese hospitals, and educate and recruit more medical students and qualified personnel. Instead of reopening randomly, they should have gradually eliminated various public health precautions, while continuing to inoculate as many individuals as possible to flatten the curve. Unfortunately, they did not do any of these things. Since reopening, many ordinary Chinese citizens have had difficulty obtaining basic over-the-counter medications, such as ibuprofen and quick antigen test kits. As a result of the outbreak of illnesses, emergency rooms, intensive care units and crematoria became the busiest sites in China. Nonetheless, the authorities appear unfazed by the disaster, as they announced the suspension of daily infection data publication and reduced COVID management to Class B, which signifies the end of quarantines. They are also determined to reopen the economy as quickly as feasible. Beijing just stated that normal international travel will resume on January the 8th, 2023. The major reason Xi Jinping scrapped zero COVID was to boost the country's weak economic growth. The IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, hailed the decisive actions, saying they might be extremely positive for the economy of China, Asia, and the rest of the globe. Following the Christmas vacation, Chinese stocks listed in Hong Kong performed well, particularly those related to tourism. Similarly, shares of European luxury firms rose on China's statement of reducing border controls, as investors hoped that Chinese tourists would begin trips overseas after years of not doing so. However, in the short term, the breakouts are causing havoc in factories and supply lines, and many analysts have cautioned that it might take months, if not years, for China to begin an economic recovery. The policy has also caused countries that are popular destinations for Chinese tourists to scramble to re-establish appropriate border control measures, even as infections in China are on the rise. Japan, for example, has restricted flights from the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong and Macau to just 4 airports, and reinstated the upon arrival negative COVID test. Italy also enforced testing of travellers flying from China, with positive results isolated, after 2 Chinese flights to Milan brought in about 100 contaminated passengers. On the same day, the United States reinstated testing requirements for Chinese visitors. Meanwhile, many have expressed concern that unrestricted infections in China could result in new subvariants or even new strains of coronavirus, perhaps causing another worldwide catastrophe, while the situation is still very fluid and the full public health ramifications are unknown. Regardless, China, like the rest of the world, is likely to gradually emerge from the shadow cast by COVID-19, which had been a huge impediment to the economic powerhouse's vibrancy. The globe will eventually profit from Chinese economic revival. While this is welcome news for many countries seeking to gain from China's economy, Beijing will still need to solve numerous domestic difficulties at home, such as structural economic reforms, to address issues such as its aging population and income disparity, to mention a few.